The alert came in at 3 in the morning, and I had learned long ago that nothing good ever arrives at 3 in the morning. I was seated at my desk in the basement office of the Earth Defense Intelligence Building in London, surrounded by monitors that glowed cold blue in the dark. My name is Claire Novak. I was 34 years old, and I had spent 11 of those years analyzing deep space communication data for a living. Most of the time that meant reading static. Most of the time that meant nothing. But I had a rule that I had lived by since my first week on the job. When the frequency band used exclusively by the Galactic Accord goes quiet, you do not go to sleep. It had been quiet for 6 days. 6 days of absolute silence from a network that normally hummed with the chatter of 100 civilizations. Trade agreements, migration permits, resource allocation orders, border dispute filings, all of it flowing constantly like a river that never stopped. And then, nothing. 6 days ago, at precisely 11:42 in the evening, the signal had cut off mid-transmission, mid-sentence, as if someone had pressed a button and decided the universe no longer needed to communicate. My supervisor had called it a technical anomaly. My colleague, a soft-spoken man named Paul Garrett, had suggested a relay station outage somewhere in the outer belt. I had said nothing because I had been watching the secondary band, the one the Accord used only when it did not want its communications to be tracked, and that band had been singing ever since. I could not decode it, not fully. The encryption the Accord used on its internal deliberation channels was generations beyond anything our best teams had cracked. But I did not need to decode it fully. I just needed to see the shape of it, the volume of it, the rhythm of it. And what I saw, night after night, sitting alone while the rest of the building slept, was the shape of an argument that had already been resolved. I was not watching a debate. I was watching a notification being sent. The alert at 3 in the morning was not from the Accord band. It was from one of my own passive sensors, a long-range biological detection array I had quietly attached to a weather satellite 3 years ago when my supervisor was on holiday. The array was not approved. It was not in any budget. It was built from repurposed components and coded in my spare time, and it had never triggered once in 3 years. It triggered 9 times in 4 minutes. I sat forward in my chair, and the cold in the room felt suddenly deeper. The detections were spread across the globe: London, Cape Town, Sydney, Mumbai, Chicago, Rio de Janeiro, Seoul, Montreal, Cairo. 9 separate locations on 9 separate continents, and every single detection was identical. Same biological signature, same mass displacement pattern, same thermal suppression profile. I had designed the array to look for organisms that actively hid their heat output. Because nothing in nature does that. Heat suppression is an engineered trait. It is a trait you build into something you do not want to be found. I reached for my coffee. My hand was steady. I had trained myself over years to keep my hand steady when my mind was running fast, because shaky hands meant other people noticed and started asking questions before I had answers ready. I pulled up the Accord's secondary band data from the past 6 days and ran a keyword correlation against a fragment I had partially decoded 8 months ago. The fragment had been brief, had arrived during a routine session, and had used a word I had spent weeks trying to place in context. The word, translated loosely from the Accord's primary diplomatic language, meant something between seeding and placement. In botanical contexts, it meant introducing an organism into a new environment. In historical Accord records, the same word appeared exactly once, in a document describing a containment procedure used against a species called the Venri 200 years ago. The Venri no longer existed. I sat with that for a moment. I looked at the 9 detection signatures on my screen. I looked at the decoded fragment. I looked at the 6 days of deliberate silence on the primary band. And then I did something I had never done in 11 years of working for Earth Defense Intelligence. I picked up my personal phone, not the office line, and I called Paul Garrett. He answered on the 3rd ring, groggy and confused. "Claire, it is 3 in the morning. "I know," I said. "Get dressed. Do not use your work badge to enter the building. Use the side entrance on Aldgate Street. Tell no one you are coming in." There was a long pause. Paul was not the kind of man who panicked easily. He had worked signals intelligence long enough to know that if someone who never called after midnight was calling after midnight, something had changed. "How bad?" he asked. I looked at the 9 signatures again. I looked at the Venri record. I looked at the silence. "I do not know yet," I said. "I think I might be wrong about all of this. I hope I am wrong about all of this. But you do not think you are wrong?" "No," I said. "I do not think I am wrong." Paul arrived 40 minutes later. He stood behind my chair and read everything I had on the screen, slowly, without saying anything. He was the kind of person who needed to see the whole picture before he spoke, which was one of the reasons I had called him, and not anyone else. When he was done reading, he pulled up a second chair, sat down beside me, and said 7 words. When did they make this decision about us? At least 6 days ago, I said, possibly longer. The secondary band traffic started spiking 8 days before the primary went silent. So they were in preliminary discussions before the formal vote. What are those 9 contacts? I believe they are the advanced placement units, I said. I believe they came in on low trajectory insertion paths, used thermal suppression to avoid our detection grids, and landed in or near each of those cities within the last 3 hours. Placement units. He said it flatly, not as a question. That is the word the Accord uses. Paul was quiet for a long time. He was looking at the detection signatures. He had his hands folded in his lap, which was what he did when he was thinking something he did not want to say out loud yet. If this is what you think it is, he said finally, then going to the director means the Accord learns that we know. If the Accord learns that we know before we have any kind of response ready, they accelerate the timeline, yes. So we cannot report this. Not yet, I agreed. How long do we have? I thought about the Venri. I thought about how the historical record described their end. Quiet, it said, gradual. The Accord's method was designed to look like natural events. Disease, environmental collapse, population decline that could always be explained by something local. By the time anyone outside the Accord had noticed what was happening to the Venri were already below the threshold for recovery. It had taken 11 years from the moment of placement to the moment of irreversibility. If they follow their standard approach, I said, we have time. But only if we move before the symptoms start. Once we start seeing the effects in the population, we are already behind. Paul nodded. He looked at the window, at the dark London street outside, at the perfectly ordinary world beyond the glass that did not yet know what I knew. Then we do not sleep tonight, he said. No, I said, we do not sleep tonight. I turned back to my screens, and for the first time in 11 years, I was not reading silence. I was reading the beginning of something, and I needed to understand every word of it before the sun came up, because when the sun came up, the world would still look exactly the same as it always had, and the people walking to work and buying their morning coffee and sending their children to school would have no idea that something had been placed among them in the dark, and whatever it was already there, in 9 cities, patient, waiting, doing exactly what it had been designed to do. My coffee had gone cold. I did not notice. I was already working. I ran the biological signatures against every database I had access to, and every database returned the same result. No match. Whatever the Accord had placed in those 9 cities was not in any file we had on record. We had extensive records on Accord biology. Over the past 40 years, since humanity had made first contact and been grudgingly acknowledged as a spacefaring species, our xenobiologists had cataloged every organism the Accord had ever shared data on. 3,000 species, hundreds of thousands of biological profiles. None of them matched what my sensor array had picked up. That told me 2 things. First, the Accord had kept this particular type of organism classified, which meant it was not a species they traded or discussed openly. Second, whatever it was designed to be undetectable by conventional means. My array had only caught it because I had specifically built the array to look for heat suppression, which was not a standard scan parameter in any of our public defense systems. I had found it by accident, by obsession, by 3 years of sitting in a basement office building sensors no one had approved. Paul was working the communications logs, cross-referencing the secondary band spikes with known Accord transmission windows. At around 4:30 in the morning, he made a small sound, barely audible, the kind of sound a person makes when they find something they were not looking for and are not happy to have found. Claire, he said, there are not 9 placements. I looked over at him. The spikes I am seeing suggest closer to 30, he said. 17 confirmed secondary band acknowledgements, consistent with placement confirmation. 17 separate insertion windows over a 14-day period. 9 of them are your detections from tonight. The others came in earlier. I felt something drop in my chest. Before my array was triggered, yes. The first insertion window appears to have opened 12 days ago. 12 days. Whatever had been placed 12 days ago had had 12 days to settle in, to begin, to start whatever process it had been designed to start. I pulled up the global health monitoring feeds, not the public ones that tracked reported illnesses. The raw feeds, the ones that aggregated emergency room intake data, the ones that pulled from pharmaceutical supply chains, the ones that watched for unusual patterns in the purchase of specific medications. If something had been active for 12 days in a populated area, there might already be traces. I found them in 3 cities. Not large traces. Nothing that would flag in a standard monitoring review. A slight uptick in reported fatigue cases in one district of Seoul, an unusual cluster of respiratory complaints in a suburb of Montreal, all from the same geographic radius, all presenting identically but all dismissed as seasonal. A small increase in unexplained neurological referrals in one hospital in Cape Town. Not enough to concern anyone, not enough to trigger any alert, not enough to trigger any alert. I sat back in my chair, and I made myself breathe slowly, because what I was looking at was a beginning, a very careful, very quiet, very deliberate beginning. Paul, I said quietly. I see it, he said. He had pulled up the same feeds without me saying anything. How long until this registers on the standard monitoring systems, at this rate of growth? I looked at the data curves. 4 weeks, maybe 6. And by then? I did not answer immediately, because the answer required me to say something that I had been refusing to fully articulate even inside my own mind. By then, I said, the people showing symptoms in Seoul and Montreal and Cape Town will be past the point where treatment helps, and whatever is in the other 14 cities will have had another 4 to 6 weeks to advance as well. The room was very quiet. Outside, London was beginning its first gray lightening toward dawn. Somewhere far above us, in orbits that looked like stars from the ground, Accord monitoring stations were watching Earth the same way they always did, passively, patiently, waiting for the process to run its course. They had done this before. They knew exactly how long it took. They had the records. They had made this decision with full information, with full deliberation, with what I was certain they considered to be the most reasoned and measured response available to them. They had looked at humanity and decided we were a problem that needed a quiet solution. I had about 6 weeks before their solution became irreversible. I had no authority to act. I had no approved budget. I had an unapproved satellite sensor array, and a colleague who had come in at 3 in the morning without using his work badge, and I had 11 years of reading silence that had finally given me something to read. It was enough. It was going to have to be enough. I opened a new encrypted file and began writing down everything I knew. The first person I told was a woman named Dr. Lena Marsh, and she thought I had lost my mind. That was fine. I had expected that. Lena was the lead xenobiologist at the University of Edinburgh's Off-World Biology Department, and she had a reputation for being the most methodically skeptical scientist in her field. She did not believe things until she had seen them 3 times from 3 different angles. She had rejected more theories in her career than most scientists had ever published. I needed that. I needed someone who would look at my data and attempt to tear it apart, because if she could not tear it apart, then I knew it was real. I drove to Edinburgh that morning, 4 hours up the motorway while Paul stayed in London managing the monitoring feeds. I brought printed copies of everything, because I did not trust digital transmission. I sat across from Lena in her office at 11 in the morning, and I laid it out in front of her, document by document, signature by signatures, health data pattern by pattern. She read everything in silence for over an hour. She asked no questions during that hour. She simply read, and occasionally made small marks in the margins with a pencil, and occasionally went very still in a way that told me she had found something she did not like. When she was done, she placed the pencil on her desk, aligned it neatly with the edge of the papers, and said, "Your thermal suppression detection methodology is sound. The biological signatures are unlike anything in the cataloged record, which you correctly identify as meaningful. The health cluster correlations are statistically weak, but directionally consistent." "I know they are weak," I said. "They will not stay weak." "No," she said. "If your model is correct, they will not." She looked at me. "If this is what you believe it is, then we have never seen anything like it. The Accord has never done anything like this to a spacefaring species. To non-spacefaring species, yes. There are historical accounts, but never to a species with active off-world presence. We are a minor spacefaring presence," I said. 3 colonies, 2 mining stations, 1 deep space research platform. From the Accord's perspective, we are barely off the ground. Still, it sets a precedent. She stood up, moved to her window, and looked out at the Edinburgh skyline. "What do you want from me, Claire?" "I need you to identify what was placed," I said, "or at least narrow down what family of organism it could be. If I know what we are dealing with, I can begin working on a response." "A response?" She said it in a tone that suggested she was not sure what a response to this situation would even look like. "Yes," I said. She turned around. "I will need your full sensor array data and access to the health cluster reports. And I will need 3 or 4 other people I trust absolutely, because this is not work one person can do alone and under a time pressure." "Who do you trust absolutely?" She thought for a moment. "Owen Birch in Cape Town. He is the best molecular analyst working today, and he has been looking at those unexplained neurological cases already, though he does not yet know what he is looking at. Ada Steele in Tokyo, computational biology. She can model organism behavior faster than anyone. And Rory Holt, because he is stubborn and wrong about everything for the first 3 days he looks at a problem. And if he eventually agrees with you, the theory is bulletproof. Contact them, I said. Do not use standard channels, obviously, said Lena. And, for the first time since I had arrived, there was something in her expression that was not skepticism. It was the look of a scientist who had found the most important problem of their career, and was already halfway through deciding how to solve it. I drove back to London feeling something I could not quite name. It was not hope, not yet. It was more like the sensation of having committed to something, of having taken the first step past the point of turning back. The second week was the hardest. Paul and I maintained the monitoring feeds, watching the health clusters grow slowly, watching the data begin to form a shape that would eventually be undeniable to anyone looking at it. Owen Birch in Cape Town called Lena 4 days after I had been to Edinburgh, and from the way Lena described the conversation to me, he had gone through the exact same stages I had gone through. Denial, analysis, reluctant conclusion, followed by a very specific kind of quiet that serious scientists experience when they understand that what they are looking at is larger than they are. Owen had been examining the Cape Town neurological cases on his own, not knowing what caused them, and he had recently managed to isolate a biological marker in the blood samples of 2 of the affected patients. The marker was unlike anything in the medical literature. It was organized at a level of complexity that did not match natural disease progression. It looked, he told Lena, as if it had been assembled rather than evolved. Word, assembled. Lena called me immediately and said, "We are not dealing with a pathogen in the traditional sense. Owen believes this is an engineered organism operating at the cellular level. Precision intervention. Not a disease that spreads and multiplies randomly. Something that identifies specific biological targets and works on them directly." "How does it spread between hosts?" I asked. "It may not need to," she said. "If there were enough units placed initially across enough population centers, each unit might be capable of operating independently within a defined area. Like separate programs running on separate machines, all executing the same instruction." I sat with that image for a moment. Not a plague that spread from person to person, visible and trackable and something you could quarantine. Instead, 17 separate, invisible self-contained mechanisms, each one quietly doing its work in its own city without any need to travel or transfer. Owen also found something else, Lena said. In the blood samples. Faint traces of a chemical compound he has never seen before, present in every affected patient, absent in the unaffected population around them. He thinks it might be a signaling compound, a way for the units to communicate with each other, or with something external. "The Accord monitoring stations," I said. "They are watching to confirm the process is working." That would be my conclusion as well. I hung up and sat in the dark of my office and thought about the word assembled. I thought about a civilization old enough to have refined this process across multiple species over hundreds of years. I thought about the engineering it would take to build something like that. The patience, the precision, the complete absence of doubt. And then, for the first time, I thought about something else. I thought about the fact that Owen Birch had found it, that he had isolated the marker, that Ada Steele's computational modeling had already produced 3 candidate behavioral profiles for the organism, that Rory Holt, who had spent the first 4 days calling everything we had wildly speculative, had gone silent for 12 hours and then resurfaced with a 40-page document proposing a counter-biological framework based on the marker Owen had found. I thought about the fact that we had been finding things. While they were doing what they had done to 17 other species before us, we had been finding things. I called Paul. "I think we need to go broader," I said. "How broad?" "I think we need to bring in the black program people." There was a pause. "Claire, if we go to the black programs, we lose control of this." "Yes," I said. "But we gain resources we do not have, and resources are what we need right now more than control." The black programs were the part of Earth's defense infrastructure that officially did not exist. They had various names over the years depending on which government was nominally overseeing them and which decade it was, but their function had always been the same. Preparing for contingencies that the public institutions could not be seen preparing for. Off-world biological containment. Extraterrestrial threat response. The kind of planning that sounds like paranoia until the moment it does not. I knew one person in that world. His name was Daniel Cross, and I had met him at a conference in Geneva 7 years ago. He had introduced himself as a military logistic consultant, We had talked for an hour about deep space monitoring methodology. He had asked questions that no military logistics consultant would know to ask, and I had asked questions that no ordinary signals analyst would know to ask. And by the end of the conversation, we both understood what the other person was, without either of us having said a word about it. I had his private number. I had never used it. I used it now. He picked up on the second ring, which told me he had been awake and that he kept his private phone close at all times. "Claire Novak," he said, and his voice carried no surprise at all, which itself was informative. "You already know something is wrong," I said. "I know the Accord primary band has been quiet for 11 days, he said. "I know we have been getting unusual atmospheric readings over 6 major population centers. I know 3 of my medical contacts have flagged unexplained patient clusters in the last week. What I do not know is what I am looking at." "I do," I said. "I need 3 hours of your time and somewhere we can talk without the Accord's monitoring assets being able to see who is in the room, together." Daniel's Cross was quiet for about 5 seconds. Then he said, "There is a facility in the Brecon Beacons. No electronic signature worth mentioning. I can have it ready tomorrow morning." "I will be there at 7, I said. I almost hung up, and then something made me add, "Daniel, we need to move quickly on this. I cannot overstate that." "I understand," he said. And the way he said it, the calmness of it, the readiness of it, the sense that he had been waiting for this call for a long time, told me something I had not expected to feel. I was not alone in this. I had not been alone in this for longer than I had known. We met in the Brecon Beacons facility at 7 the next morning. It was a converted farmhouse from the outside and a very serious installation from the inside, and it already had 8 people in it when I arrived. I recognized none of them. Daniel made no introductions by name. Everyone in the room understood why. I stood at a plain table, and I walked through everything, calmly and in order, without dramatizing anything, without speculating beyond what the evidence supported. I laid out the sensor data, the health cluster analysis, the marker findings from Owen's samples, Ada's behavioral modeling, Rory's counter-biological framework document. I spoke for 90 minutes without stopping. When I was done, the room was silent for a long time. Then a woman on Daniel's left, perhaps 50 years old, with short gray hair and the kind of posture that comes from a lifetime of being the most prepared person in any room, said, "How confident are you in the 6-week window?" "Moderately," I said. "It could be 8, it could be 4. The growth rate of the health clusters is the best indicator I have, and the growth rate is consistent so far." "What does Dr. Marsh's team need to accelerate the organism identification?" "Laboratory access, unrestricted. The samples Owen collected from Cape Town. Probably 48 hours of uninterrupted computational time on a system not connected to any external network." The woman looked at Daniel. Daniel nodded. "Done," she said. "What else?" I looked around the room at the 8 faces watching me. I had come here expecting to convince people. I had prepared arguments for skepticism, for bureaucratic delay, for the kind of institutional reluctance that had frustrated me at every turn for 11 years. I had prepared for a fight. There was no fight. These were people who had already decided years ago that they would move fast when the moment came. They had been building resources and plans and contacts in silence, the same way I had been building my unapproved sensor array in silence, and they had been waiting for someone to walk into a room and tell them what the moment looked like. I had walked into the room. "One more thing," I said. "We cannot let the Accord know we have found this. Not yet. Not until we have a response ready. Everything we do from this point forward has to look, from the outside, exactly like a normal day." "Agreed," said Daniel. "And when we do have a response ready," I said, "it has to be something they have never seen before, because the only reason they are doing this is that they believe they already know every possible thing humanity is capable of. They have run their models. They have read our history. They think they understand us." I paused, and I thought about Lena reading my documents in silence for an hour, about Owen isolating the marker in 2 days, about Rory's 40-page framework that had arrived without warning, about the 8 people in this room who had been building for this without knowing what they were building for. "They do not understand us," I said, "and we are going to prove it." No one cheered. No one made any grand declaration. But the woman with the gray hair looked at me with an expression that I had seen only a few times in my life, the expression of someone who has found what they were looking for, and she said simply, "Let's get to work." We did. The next 7 days were unlike anything I had experienced in my professional life. I had worked under pressure before. I had worked long hours, pushed through exhaustion, operated on shortened deadlines. But this was different from all of that. Because this was not the pressure of a bureaucratic timeline or a funding review or a publication deadline. This was the pressure of knowing that every hour that passed was an hour in which the thing in those 17 cities was doing its work, and every hour we moved was an hour we might be pulling that work backward. Lena and her team, given unrestricted laboratory access in the Cape Town samples, moved faster than I had thought possible. Ada Steele's computational modeling narrowed the behavioral profile to 3 candidate organism types within 36 hours. Owen Birch worked without sleep for 2 days, and on the morning of the 3rd day he called me with a voice that was hoarse and excited in equal measure. "I have it," he said. "Not a full identification. The genetic architecture is too complex for a full identification at this speed. But I have the operating principle." "Tell me," I said. "It is not one organism," he said. "It is a colony organism. Thousands of micro-units operating as a coordinated network. Each unit is individually simple, but together they form something with a degree of organized behavior that is genuinely remarkable. The colony identifies specific cell types in the nervous system, attaches to them at the molecular level, and begins a process of very gradual structural modification. Over weeks and months, the modifications accumulate until the host nervous system begins to exhibit the symptoms we are seeing in Cape Town and Seoul and Montreal. Can you interrupt the process? Theoretically, yes. If you can introduce a compound that binds to the molecular attachment sites before the colony units do, you prevent the attachment entirely. The colony units without attachment sites have no function and degrade naturally within days. Do you have such a compound? I have the molecular profile of the attachment sites. Building a compound that targets them is the next step, and it is not a small step. But it is a step I know how to take. I relayed everything to Daniel and to the gray-haired woman, whose name I had still not been given. She listened and then said, "I need a production timeline. How long from compound design to large-scale manufacturing?" Owen's estimate was 6 weeks minimum, 12 weeks more likely, which put us right at the edge of the window we had, and that was assuming perfect execution at every stage, which nothing in science ever was. But it was possible. That was the critical word. Possible. I should have felt relieved by that, and in one part of my mind I did. But in another part, a part I had been keeping carefully quiet since the beginning of all this, I was thinking about something beyond the immediate crisis. We could protect the people who were already showing symptoms, if Owen was right and if the timeline held. We could prevent further progress in the 17 cities, if the compound worked, but we could not address the fundamental situation, which was that the Galactic Accord had voted to end humanity, and had sent engineered organisms to carry out that decision, and they were still up there in their monitoring stations watching Earth. And if we neutralized this effort, what stopped them from trying again with something different? What stopped them from doing it more quickly next time, knowing that we had somehow detected the first attempt? I kept this question to myself for 3 days. I thought about it while the science team worked, while Daniel and his colleagues coordinated logistics, while Paul in London quietly and carefully watched the health data for any signs of acceleration. Turned the question over and looked at it from every side, and every time I arrived at the same conclusion, one I was not ready to say aloud until I was certain it was correct. On the 4th day I said it aloud. I said it to Daniel privately, at the end of a long debrief session, when the others had left the room and it was just the 2 of us. We need to do more than cure the symptoms. He waited for me to continue. Neutralizing the colony organisms buys us time. It might save the people in those 17 cities. But the Accord still exists, their decision still stands. Their reasoning, whatever it is, has not changed. And we are a minor presence in this galaxy, with 3 colonies and 2 mining stations and 1 research platform, and no meaningful defensive posture against a civilization that can engineer something like what they put in those cities. "What are you proposing?" Daniel asked. He was not a man who showed much expression, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he had been waiting for someone to get to this point. "I am proposing that we do not just defend," I said. "I am proposing that we give the Accord a reason to reconsider its decision, not by appealing to them, not by negotiating from a position of weakness, but by demonstrating something they did not factor into their models when they voted." "And what is that?" "That they underestimated us," I said. "That whatever they believe humanity is capable of, the actual answer is something they have never seen before, and it is something that changes the calculation." Daniel looked at me for a long moment. "You are talking about using the organism itself." "I am talking about using the principle," I said. "The colony structure, the molecular precision, the engineered coordination. Owen has the full structural analysis. Ada has the behavioral model. Rory has a counter-biological framework that is, from what I understand, quite extraordinary in its scope. We do not just have a cure. We have a blueprint. A blueprint for what? I had been thinking about how to say this for 3 days. I had been trying to find a way to say it that was measured and clinical and did not sound like something that should frighten anyone. I could not find such a way. So I said it plainly. For building something better, I said. Something of our own, based on their design but improved by ours. Not to harm, not to replicate what they did to us, but to create a capability they did not know we could develop. A deterrent, proof that humanity does not just absorb what is done to it, proof that we learn, and we build, and what we build has consequences. The room was very quiet. Daniel Cross, who I had never seen look uncertain about anything, was looking at me with an expression I could not fully read. That is a significant step, he said. Yes, I said, it is. The Accord, if they discovered we were doing this, would consider it a provocation. They already consider us a problem worth eliminating, I said. I am not sure how much further we can fall in their estimation. He was quiet again. Then he said, I need to bring this to a higher level than what we have assembled here. This decision is not mine to make alone. I know, I said. I am not asking you to make it alone. I am asking you to put it on the table. He nodded once. That night, for the first time in 2 weeks, I slept for more than 3 hours. Not because the fear had gone away. The fear had not gone away. But because there is a different quality to fear when you are moving towards something rather than away from something. And I had been moving away from things for 11 years, reading silence, watching patterns, waiting for something I could act on. I was acting now. The next morning, Daniel brought me into a briefing with people I had not seen before. 2 of them, a man named George Aldred and a woman named Nina Fowler, introduced themselves without titles but with the kind of authority that did not need titles. They had read everything. They had been briefed overnight. They wanted to hear it from me directly. I went through it again, calmly and in order, and when I reached the part about the proposal, I did not soften it. I laid it out the same way I had laid it out to Daniel. When I was done, Nina Fowler said, Dr. Marsh's team can do this. Build what you are describing. They can begin it, I said. With the right additional resources and with specialists from fields we have not yet brought in, yes. I believe it is possible. The timeline? Unknown at this point. Owen needs to complete the counter-compound work first. But the foundational research that makes this possible, we already have it. It was generated as a byproduct of trying to stop what was done to us. George Aldred said nothing for a long time. Then he said, if we do this, we are not just defending Earth, we are changing what Earth is. Yes, I said, we are. He looked at Nina. Something passed between them that I could not read. Then he looked back at me and said, you have authorization to proceed. All resources available. Full access, no limits. I did not feel triumphant. I felt the weight of it, which was appropriate, because the weight was real, and it was considerable, and it was the weight of a decision that there was no coming back from. But I had sat in a basement office for 11 years reading silence, and the silence had finally said something, and the answer was not to close my eyes and pretend I had not heard it. Thank you, I said. I called Paul that afternoon. He had been monitoring the health data feeds alone in London for 2 weeks, and he answered immediately. How are the clusters? I asked. Stable, he said. No significant acceleration. The Cape Town cluster may be showing very slight improvement, though it is too early to call it that definitively. That might be Owen's preliminary compound work, I said. He has been running some localized tests. Claire, Paul said. What is happening? Are we going to be all right? I looked out the window at the Brecon beacons, at the hills in the gray morning light, at the ordinary world that did not know any of this and would not know any of it for a long time, perhaps ever. We are going to be fine, I said, but we are also going to be different. On the other side of this, we are going to be something the galaxy has not seen before. He was quiet for a moment. Is that a good thing? I think so, I said. I think it has to be. Owen Birch delivered the first viable countercompound on a Tuesday morning, 23 days after I had first called Lena Marsh from a motorway levee. He delivered it in person, flying from Cape Town with a sample case that he held on his lap the entire flight and did not let anyone else touch. He was a tall, angular man with the kind of permanent tiredness behind his eyes that accumulates over years of difficult scientific work and never fully leaves. He shook my hand in the Brecon Beacons facility and said, It works. I have tested it against isolated colony units in controlled conditions and it works completely. The attachment sites are neutralized. The units degrade within 48 hours. No side effects in the host tissue? I asked. Negligible, he said. The compound is selective. It does not interact with standard biological processes. It was designed to And I do not use that word loosely. We sat together that afternoon with Lena and Ada and Rory, all of them in the same room for the first time, and Owen walked through the full synthesis. Rory Holt, who had a tendency to ask sharp questions at uncomfortable moments, asked about scalability, about delivery mechanism, about the logistical challenge of treating 17 cities without creating a public panic, or triggering any external detection. The conversation went on for 6 hours. I said almost nothing. I watched and listened because this was their domain, not mine, and what they were doing in that room was something extraordinary. 4 scientists, working under time pressure with incomplete information and resources that had materialized around them with unusual speed, constructing a solution to a problem that should not have been solvable in the time available. By the end of the evening, they had a deployment plan. The compound could be aerosolized. It could be introduced into urban air circulation systems in concentrations high enough to be effective but low, enough to be undetectable by the monitoring systems the Accord used to observe Earth. The Accord's sensors looked for biological threats, not biological solutions. They would not see it. The operation would require simultaneous deployment across all 17 cities to prevent any adaptation in the colony units in the remaining cities. It would require coordination between national governments that could not be told the full truth of what they were doing, only enough to gain access to infrastructure. It would require Owen's compound to be manufactured at a scale that strained the facility's capabilities. It required all of that, and it was the easiest part of what had been set in motion. Because while the counter-compound team was building a defense, another team, assembled quietly by Daniel Cross in a separate wing of the facility, was building something else. Project Ouroboros, as George Aldred named it, began with Rory Holt's 40-page framework document, and with Ada Steele's behavioral modeling, and with a biological engineer named Callum Reeves, who had spent his career working on colony organism dynamics in a university context and who had never, until he was brought to the Brecon Beacons facility, understood what his research was being prepared for. Callum was 29 years old. He had a nervous energy about him that manifested as constant movement, always tapping a pen or shifting in his seat or bouncing his knee under the table, and he had the specific quality of intelligence that comes with very early mastery of a complex field, the quality that looks like arrogance from the outside, but is actually just the absence of doubt about the technical details, even when everything else is uncertain. He read Owen's structural analysis of the Accord organism and said, without any preamble, "The efficiency is remarkable, but the architecture is conservative. They built this to be reliable, not optimal. There are at least 3 places in the colony communication network where the signal pathway could be significantly shortened, which would give a human-designed analog considerably better response time." Everyone in the room looked at him. "You understand what we are building?" I said. "Yes," he said without hesitation, "and I understand why, and I can make it better." There are moments in a project when something shifts, when the possibility that you have been working towards suddenly feels real, rather than theoretical. And this was one of those moments. Not because Callum Reeves said anything that changed the fundamental parameters, but because the way he said it, the complete and unaffected confidence of it, made it impossible to continue treating this as a plan that might work. In that moment it became a plan that would work. I found out about my brother 3 weeks later. I had known my brother Daniel, not to be confused with Daniel Cross, had been involved in some capacity with the defense programs. He had joined the military at 18, had spent 6 years in standard service, and had then disappeared into a classification bracket that meant our mother received quarterly letters confirming he was still alive and healthy, and nothing else. We had spoken rarely over the years. The nature of what he did made it difficult, and the nature of what I did made it complicated. And we had settled into a relationship of occasional brief calls and the unspoken understanding that we both knew the other was doing things that could not be fully discussed. I found out he had volunteered for Project Ouroboros from a list Daniel Cross gave me when I asked for the composition of the biological enhancement volunteer cohort. I read his name and I read it again and I said nothing for a long time. He applied 6 months ago, Daniel Cross told me, before any of this. The volunteer program was already in development as a theoretical framework. When Ouroboros moved from theoretical to active, the volunteers already in the pool were the first cohort. 6 months ago, I said, he knew something was coming. Everyone in that program did. They signed up because they knew something was coming and they wanted to be the response to it. I asked if I could see him. Daniel Cross said yes, and brought me to a part of the facility I had not been in before. A clean and quiet room with simple furniture and very good light, and my brother was sitting in a chair by the window reading a book. He looked the same, mostly. There were differences if you knew what to look for. A quality of stillness in his posture that had not been there before. A precision in the way he moved when he stood up, as if each movement was being done exactly as much as needed and not slightly more, which is what most people's bodies do without thinking about it. He looked at me, and he smiled, and the smile was exactly the same as it had always been, which made everything much easier and much harder simultaneously. "Claire," I said. We sat together for an hour. He did not tell me everything about the process, and I did not ask. He told me he was well. He told me he was certain about what he had done. He told me that when Ouroboros was ready, he would be going out with the first deployment group, and he did not apologize for that, because he was not the kind of person who apologized for things he had chosen deliberately. "Are you afraid?" I asked. "No," he said, and I believed him, because he had never been the kind of person who lied about that. I drove back from his wing of the facility with something sitting heavy and real in my chest, and I sat with it for a full day before I let it go, because it was real, and it deserved to be sat with. Then I went back to work. The counter-compound deployment took place on a Thursday, at 3 in the morning, in all 17 cities simultaneously. I was in the operations room, watching the coordination feeds. 17 separate teams, working in darkness, accessing air circulation infrastructure with authorizations that had been obtained through channels I did not entirely understand and did not need to. Within 4 hours, the compound was in the air in every target city. Within 48 hours, Owen confirmed that the colony units in the 3 cities where we had biological monitoring were showing signs of degradation. By the end of the first week, the health cluster data in Seoul, Montreal, and Cape Town had stopped growing. By the end of the second week, it had begun to reverse. I called Paul when the Cape Town reversal became statistically significant. He had been watching the data feeds alone for so long that I think the news took a moment to register, and then he made a sound like someone who had been holding their breath for a month. "It is working," he said. "Yes," I said. "All 17? "All 17. The colony units have no viable attachment sites. Without function, they degrade. Owen says within 60 days there will be no detectable trace in any of the cities." Paul was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Does the Accord know? Their monitoring stations will be expecting to see the health clusters grow," I said. "When they see them stop growing and reverse, they will know something has changed. Whether they know what changed, I cannot say, but they will know. What do they do then?" "That," I said, "is the question we are now working on answering before they do." Project Ouroboros moved from the development phase into the final testing phase in the same week that the last of the counter-compound deployments confirmed successful degradation in all 17 cities. Callum Reeves had not slept more than 5 hours in any 24-hour period in a month, and he had the hollow-eyed intensity of someone in the grip of work that had consumed everything else. Ada Steele's behavioral models were being updated daily as the testing data came in. Rory Holt, who had long since moved from skepticism to something that looked almost like wonder, was writing papers in his spare moments that he knew he would never be able to publish. I watched the first full deployment test from the observation room, and I will not describe everything I saw there. Not because it was terrible, though some of it was difficult, but because there are things that belong to the people who did them, and not to the people who watched. And my brother and the others in that room had chosen what they had chosen with full knowledge, and what they had become was theirs. What I will say is this. The Accord had spent centuries perfecting the art of invisible, patient, precise biological action. They had developed it to a level of sophistication that genuinely deserved the word mastery. They had applied it to 17 other species before us, and they had refined their method each time, learning from each application what could be improved. We had had the structural analysis for less than 8 weeks, and what Callum Reeves had built, based on that analysis, using the design as a foundation, and then going further with it than the original designers had thought to go, was something that the Accord's models had not included in any of their projections about what a species in our developmental position could produce. Callum sat beside me after the test and said quietly, "They will recognize the architecture. They will know it is derived from their own work." "Yes," I said. "What do you think they will do when they realize that?" I thought about the deliberation sessions on the secondary band. I thought about the 6 days of silence before the primary band went quiet. I thought about the word assembled, and the word seeding, and the measured ancient confidence of a civilization that had looked at humanity and decided the outcome before the process had even begun. "I think," I said, They are going to have a very different kind of conversation about us. 3 days later, the first Accord monitoring station changed its orbital pattern. It was a small change, subtle, the kind of adjustment that most people would not notice, and that the Accord would insist, if anyone asked, was routine maintenance. But it was the first time in 40 years that an Accord monitoring station had changed its orbit in relation to Earth, and it was not moving further away. It was moving to a different angle, the angle of a facility that has realized it may be being observed. I told Daniel Cross, George Aldred and Nina Fowler, and George Aldred, looking at the orbital data on his screen with an expression I could not read, said, "They are starting to notice." "Yes," I said. "Then it is time," he said. He looked at me, and for the first time since all of this had begun, he looked at me not as a problem that had been brought to him, but as the person who had started this, as the person who was going to have to see it through. "You started this, Claire," he said. "What happens next, you need to be in the room for." I nodded. I had known this was coming. I had been preparing for it since the morning 3 months ago when I had sat in a cold office at 3 in the morning and watched 9 impossible signatures appear on a sensor array that was not supposed to exist. "I know," I said. "I am ready." I was not entirely sure that was true. But it was the right thing to say, and more importantly, it was close enough to true that the difference was not worth measuring. We had survived. We had done more than survive. And now the galaxy was watching us from a different angle. Good, I thought. Let it watch. The orbital repositioning of the Accord monitoring station was followed, within 72 hours, by a second development. The Accord primary communication band came back online, not for outgoing transmissions, not with the regular chatter of 100 civilizations discussing trade and migration, and the small administrative business of a galactic community. It came back online at a specific frequency that I recognized immediately from the archived records I had been studying for 3 months. A frequency that the Accord had used historically in only one context: direct contact with a species under observation. They were not announcing an attack. They were not issuing a formal statement. They were opening a channel. I told Daniel Cross within 2 minutes of detecting it. He had people monitor it around the clock for the next 24 hours. The channel stayed open but silent. No message came through. Just the carrier signal, patient and steady, a door left ajar. "They are waiting for us to respond," I said. "Yes," said Daniel, "but they do not know how much we know, and they do not know what we have built," I said. "They know their operation was disrupted. They know the health clusters reversed. They may be beginning to understand that we detected their placement units, because that is the only explanation for how we reversed the process. But Ouroboros, the testing, the volunteer cohort, none of that is visible to their sensors. They do not know the full picture, which means," said George Aldred, "that we can choose what they learn and when." "Yes," I said, and that choice mattered enormously, because if the Accord believed we had merely been lucky in our detection, if they believed we had found a defensive solution through fortunate accident, their recalculation would be modest. They would revise their timeline, perhaps. They would prepare a more robust method for the next attempt. The channel they had opened would be a prelude to a new set of terms that we would again be in a weak position to refuse. But if they understood what we had actually done, if they understood that in response to their engineered assassination attempt we had taken their own biological architecture, improved it, and produced something new with it in a matter of weeks, their recalculation would be of a completely different order. We did not want them to be merely deterred. We needed them to understand something fundamental about humanity that they had not previously known, and to understand it in a way that made any future version of what they had tried genuinely unthinkable. I spent 2 days writing a response to the Accord's open channel. Not a political document, not a diplomatic appeal, a technical document, a precise, detailed account of what we had found, what we had built, what we had done, and what we were capable of doing further. Written in the Accord's own scientific notation format, which our translation teams had long since mastered. Written not as a threat but as a data transfer, the same way one scientist might send another scientist a paper, factual and clear and complete. I included Owen's full structural analysis. I included Ada's behavioral models. I included the counter-compound synthesis and the deployment methodology. And at the end, I included the Ouroboros test results. Not everything, not the full capability profile, but enough to make the picture undeniably clear. Rory Holt read the document before I sent it and said, with the specific tone of someone who found something technically excellent and philosophically troubling in equal measure, "This is either the most important communication in human history or the last one." "I know," I said. "You are certain about this." I thought about what the Accord would do if we said nothing. If we let the channel sit open and sent no response, they would interpret silence as ignorance, as species that had stumbled into a solution without understanding what they had solved, and they would begin preparing again. Yes, I said, I am certain. I transmitted the document on a Thursday evening, encoding it with the mathematical prefix the Accord used to indicate a formal scientific submission, which was also, in Accord protocol, a flag that requested a response in kind, not a negotiation opener, not an appeal, a technical paper, sent scientist to scientist across the void between our world and their stations, saying here is what we found, and here is what we did with it. The response took 16 hours. It was not from a monitoring station. It was from a deep space relay that our tracking systems placed approximately 4 light hours from Earth, which meant it had originated from a vessel, a large vessel based on the signal strength, a vessel that had been in this system for some time without identifying itself. The Accord had observers here who we had not known about, an extra layer of surveillance beyond the monitoring stations, positioned farther out, presumably to serve as a secondary confirmation of the process going as expected. That vessel had received my document 4 hours after transmission and had spent the following 12 hours doing something. Then it had sent a response. The response was 3 words in Accord formal protocol: request direct communication. I looked at those 3 words for a long time. The Accord did not request things. The Accord notified, directed, assessed, determined, and announced. In 40 years of humanity's contact with the Galactic Accord, the Accord had never used the word request in direct communication with a human entity. They are asking, Paul said. He was standing behind my shoulder reading the transmission. Yes, I said. That is new, he said. Yes, I said. It is. The direct communication was established the following morning over a secure channel that took 4 hours to configure. On one end, a room in the Brecon Beacons facility. On the other, a voice, translated in real time, from the Accord vessel that had been watching us from 4 light hours out. The voice belonged to an entity whose title translated as Assessor Prime. This was a role that existed in the Accord hierarchy, at a level I had not previously encountered in any of our communications records. The Accord had not sent a monitoring technician or a diplomat or an enforcement officer. They had sent whoever it was that made the assessments that preceded decisions. The Assessor Prime spoke for 11 minutes. The translation team rendered it into English in real time. I sat in the room and listened. The Accord had been observing humanity for 62 years. They had run predictive models. They had assessed our development rate, our technological trajectory, our historical behavior patterns. They had concluded, with a high degree of confidence, that within 3 centuries humanity would represent a significant destabilizing presence in the local galactic cluster. Their conclusion was not based on hostility or malice. It was based on what they called strategic equilibrium management, the same principle by which they had addressed similar assessments about other species in the past. The Assessor Prime said this without apology. It was a statement of fact as the Accord understood facts. Then it said this: the document we had transmitted had necessitated a revision of the assessment. Not because the threat designation was being removed. Not because the Accord had changed its fundamental position about humanity, but because the assessment had been predicated on a model of human capability that the document had demonstrated was insufficient. The Accord's models had not included the specific adaptive response profile that the document described. They had underestimated the rate and depth of human biological learning by a factor that required recalculation. The recalculation was ongoing. The Assessor Prime then said, the direct communication channel was being offered because the Accord's revised assessment suggested that a direct communication approach might produce superior strategic outcomes compared to the previously selected method. This was stated without embarrassment. It was a reallocation of approach based on updated data, which to the Accord was no different from adjusting a navigation path based on new coordinates. Then it asked a question. It asked what humanity intended to do with what it had built. I had prepared for many possible shapes that this conversation might take. I had not prepared for that specific question, asked in that specific way, in the direct, unembellished language of an entity that wanted a clear answer and had no interest in anything else. I looked at George Aldred. He looked at me, and I answered. I said that what humanity had built was not a weapon in the sense that the Accord used that word. It was a capability, a capacity for adaptive biological response. The same thing in principle that the Accord itself had developed, but arrived at through a different path. The same thing, in principle, that every organism that had ever survived long enough to develop intelligence had arrived at through evolutionary pressure. the ability to understand a threat, model it, and produce a response proportional to it. I said that humanity had no interest in using that capability aggressively, not against the Accord, not against any other species, but that we would not dismantle it, because we were not prepared to operate in a galaxy where the largest political body had demonstrated a willingness to act against us without warning or dialogue, and we had no deterrent. I said that the Accord wished to have a different kind of relationship with humanity, one based on dialogue and mutual transparency rather than surveillance and silent action. We were open to that. We had always been open to that. We had simply never been offered it. The Assessor Prime was silent for 47 seconds. I counted. Then it said, "This communication will be submitted to the Accord deliberation body. A response will be provided within the standard deliberation window." The channel closed. I sat in the room for a long time after that. The people around me were doing various things. Some were looking at screens. Some were talking quietly. George Aldred had gone to stand by the window with his hands in his pockets, which was what he did when he was thinking something he was not ready to say. Paul, who had come down from London 2 days earlier, and who had been sitting quietly at the back of the room during the entire communication, got up and came to sit beside me. "What is the standard deliberation window?" he asked. "For formal species-level assessments," I said. "Usually between 3 and 6 months. So we wait," he said. "We wait," I said. "And in the meantime?" "In the meantime," I said, "we keep building. We keep getting better. We do not stop because they are thinking. We stop when the situation no longer requires us to move." He nodded. Outside the window, the Brecon Beacons hills were green and gray under a slow November sky. Somewhere above those clouds, 4 light hours out, a vessel was processing what we had said and preparing to send it to a deliberating body that had never, in its entire history, received a communication quite like the one we had sent. I thought about the moment, 3 months ago, when I had sat at my desk at 3 in the morning and watched 9 signatures appear on an unapproved sensor array. I had no idea in that moment that the thing I was looking at was a beginning, not just a threat, a beginning. Humanity had always been good at beginnings. The Accord deliberation window turned out to be 4 months and 11 days. I know the exact duration because I counted every one of them. Not obsessively, not with dread, but the way a navigator counts the distance between 2 known points, precisely and without sentimentality, because the accuracy matters. During those 4 months and 11 days, the world did not know what was happening. The health clusters had reversed. The strange illness patterns in Cape Town and Seoul and Montreal had been attributed, in the medical literature that eventually reported on them, to a newly identified environmental factor related to air quality. The papers were peer-reviewed and accepted and cited, and they were not wrong in the way that false things are wrong. They simply described an effect without knowing the cause. Owen Birch, who had done more to stop those health clusters than any 10 other people, was listed as a contributing author on one of those papers under his actual name, with an affiliation that was technically accurate and completely uninformative about what he had actually been doing. He found that amusing, in the dry way that exhausted scientists find things amusing. Callum Reeves spent the 4 months continuing to develop Ouroboros, not sitting still and waiting for permission, moving. He was constitutionally incapable of not moving when there was a technical problem in front of him, and the technical problem in front of him was vast and interesting, and had no ceiling on how far it could go. Ada Steele worked alongside him, and Rory Holt, who had moved through skepticism and wonder, and arrived at somewhere that looked like commitment, was writing the theoretical frameworks that would give the work a foundation that could be built on by people who came after. My brother Dan, and the others in the first Pale cohort, were deployed on 2 operations during those months. Both operations were internal, involving biological threats not related to the Accord, organisms that had been on our watch lists for years, and that the Pale were uniquely equipped to address. I was not told the full details of either deployment. What I was told was that both operations concluded successfully and without civilian impact, and that in each case the resolution time was a fraction of what conventional methods would have required. I thought about that. I sat with the weight of it, and then I put it away, because it was my brother's to carry, not mine, and he had chosen to carry it, and I had learned over the course of this entire experience that choosing something and accepting its weight was not a tragedy. It was the only honest way to act in a world where everything worth doing had a cost. I saw Dan twice during those 4 months, both times briefly. He was, in the ways that mattered to me, entirely himself. The stillness was still there, that quality of exact, considered movement that had taken some getting used to. But his humor was unchanged. His interest in the world was unchanged. He asked me questions about the Accord negotiations with genuine curiosity, and listened to my answers with the specific attention of someone who understood that what I was doing was as important as what he was doing, even though the skills involved were nothing alike. The second time I saw him, as I was leaving, he said, "You know, when I signed up, I thought my part would be the loud part and yours would be the quiet part. I had it backwards. I thought about that for a long time. For our time, a more Discord response came on a Tuesday morning at 9:42 in the morning, which felt appropriate to me in a way I could not fully articulate. Important things at 3 in the morning, answers at 9:42. It came in through the same channel the Assessor Prime had used, and it was formally structured as a standard Accord species assessment revision document. There were 17 numbered sections. I read all 17 sections that morning, in the Brecon Beacons facility, seated at a plain table with Paul on my left and Daniel Cross on my right and George Aldred and Nina Fowler across from me, and a translation team standing against the wall. The first 10 sections were procedural. They recited the original assessment parameters, the basis for the original determination, the subsequent action taken, the anomalous outcome of that action, and the methodology of the revised assessment. They were dense and technical and important, but their significance was contained in the conclusion, which was Section 11. Section 11 stated that the revised assessment had produced a change in humanity's formal classification from cascade risk to emergent adaptive species. This was a different category entirely. It was a category that the Accord used for species that demonstrated, under assessment conditions, a level of adaptive capability that exceeded predictive modeling. The category carried certain implications. It meant that the standard management protocols that had applied to humanity under the Cascade Risk designation were suspended. It meant that the original determination was formally withdrawn, and it meant, in the Accord's formal language, that the species in question was recognized as having properties that warranted continued observation rather than intervention. Section 12 stated that humanity was invited to formally engage with the Accord Species Relations Framework, which was the diplomatic structure through which spacefaring civilizations maintained communication and established mutual protocols. Section 13 through 16 address specific conditions and expectations associated with that engagement. Section 17 was 2 sentences long. It stated that the Accord formally acknowledged that the methods used against Earth had been applied in error, where error was defined in Accord protocol as a strategic action that produced an outcome the opposite of its intended purpose. It stated that the formal acknowledgement was entered into the permanent record, not an apology. The Accord did not have a tradition of apology in the way humans understood it, but an acknowledgement of error in a permanent record was, within their framework, as significant as anything they were capable of producing. I read those 2 sentences in Section 17 3 times. Then I looked up and said, "The Cascade Risk designation is rescinded." The room was very quiet for a moment. Then Paul said quietly, "We are not going to be eliminated." "No," I said, "we are not." George Aldred, who was the least outwardly expressive person I had ever worked with, closed his eyes briefly and breathed out. That was all. It was enough. We spent the rest of that day working through the implications of sections 12 through 16. The conditions the Accord had attached to the formal engagement invitation were significant and would require extensive discussion with people far above anyone in that room. Section 13 required that humanity designate official representatives for the species relations framework with appropriate credentials. Section 14 required a formal commitment to certain communication protocols regarding our off-world activities. Section 15 was about technology transfer restrictions and was going to be very complicated for a very long time. And Section 16, which I had been expecting in some form since the moment I had responded to the Assessor Prime 4 months ago, addressed Ouroboros directly. Section 16 stated that the Accord was aware of the existence of what it termed Earth's Adaptive Biological Program. It stated that the program, as described in the technical document submitted to the Assessor Prime, was classified under Accord protocols as a Category 7 biological capability, which was the highest category in their taxonomy. It stated that the Accord requested, not required, requested, that this program remain in a research and development status rather than being converted to an active deployment framework. It was not a demand, it was a request. The same way the Assessor Prime's first communication had been a request rather than an order, the Accord was speaking to us differently than it had ever spoken to anyone. Section 16 also stated that the Accord was prepared to discuss a formal role for Earth's adaptive biological program in the context of threats identified by the Accord that exceeded the containment capabilities of existing member species. It framed this as a preliminary exploration of potential collaboration, without commitment, without binding obligation. I read Section 16 twice. Then I read it a third time. They want us as an enforcement arm, Daniel Cross said. He had been reading over my shoulder and reached the same conclusion at the same moment. They want to explore what that might look like, I said carefully. There is a significant difference. Is there, from a practical standpoint? I thought about it. The Accord was the largest political structure in the local galactic cluster. It had managed interspecies relations for thousands of years with a combination of diplomatic frameworks and, when those failed, precise and targeted interventions of the kind that had been used on us. Those interventions were possible because the Accord had species in its network whose capabilities were suited to them. The Accord had just discovered that humanity had built something that was better at that kind of work than anything they currently had access to. It is a significant difference, I said. Because we do not go in as a subject species, we go in as a partner who brings something. That changes the terms of everything. Nina Fowler, who had been quiet through most of the session, said, "The question of what we bring and what we ask in return for bringing it is the most important conversation this planet will have in the next 10 years. Yes, I said, it is. We drafted the formal response to the Accord's 17 sections over the following 3 weeks. It was the most carefully written document I had ever been involved with, and I had written careful documents for 11 years. It was reviewed by 47 people across 8 countries before a final version was approved, and the final version was translated, checked, retranslated, checked again, and then sent on a Thursday morning through the same channel the Accord had used. Our response accepted the revised classification and the withdrawal of the original determination. It agreed to engage with the species relations framework and to designate official representatives, and it proposed a timeline for doing so. It addressed the communication protocol requirements in Section 14 and committed to a working group on Section 15. On Section 16, our response was the most carefully worded of all. It stated that Earth's adaptive biological program was not subject to Accord conditions of any kind, as it was a sovereign development of a species that had not, at the time of its development, been a participant in any Accord framework and therefore not bound by Accord protocols regarding military technology. It further stated that Earth was aware of the Accord's interest in the potential collaborative use of this program and was prepared to enter into exploratory discussions on that subject, without commitment and without binding obligation, in a format that recognized full Earth sovereignty over the program and its deployment decisions. It was, in the language of diplomatic documents, a polite and unambiguous statement that we would make our own choices about Ouroboros, that we were interested in talking about a partnership, and that the terms of any such partnership would be negotiated between equals. Daniel Cross read the final version and said, "They are going to find the tone of this unexpected." "Good," I said. "We have been finding their tone unexpected for 40 years. It will do them good to understand how that feels." The Accord's acknowledgement of our response came within 48 hours, which by their standards was nearly instantaneous. It was brief. It confirmed receipt of our position, noted that the exploratory discussions on Section 16 would be scheduled through the Species Relations Framework, and assigned us a formal contact designation within that framework. For the first time in the history of our interaction with the Galactic Accord, we had a desk, not a watching brief, not a file in a monitoring archive, a desk, a place in the organizational structure that was ours, that had our name on it, that represented us as something other than a problem being managed. I told Paul over the phone that evening. He had been in London the whole time, had lived through all of this at a distance, reading my reports, watching the health data, the most reliable and careful person I had ever worked with. "A desk," he said. "A desk," I said. He was quiet for a moment, and I could hear him thinking, the way I had always been able to hear people thinking when I knew them well enough. "What do you think the Accord tells its other members about us?" he asked. "I have been wondering the same thing," I said. "Whatever they say, I think it will be different from what they said before. Before they said we were a problem. Before they said we were a predictable one," I corrected. "That is the thing that mattered to them. Not whether we were a problem, whether we were a known quantity, something they could model and project and plan for. And now?" I looked out the window of the facility at the hills, dark blue in the evening. "Now they know they cannot fully model us," I said. And I think that is the most important thing that has changed. Not whether they respect us, not whether they fear us, whether they have to take us seriously as something they do not fully understand. Is that enough? Paul asked. It is a start, I said. It is a very good start. The weeks that followed the Accord acknowledgement were a different kind of busy. Not the desperate, compressed, 3 in the morning busyness of a crisis being raced against a clock. This was institutional busy, the kind that involves briefings and working groups, and policy papers, and intergovernmental meetings that stretch across time zones and never quite start on schedule. Governments had to be brought in. Not all of them, not all at once, and not with the full picture immediately, because the full picture required a context that took hours to establish properly and a trust that could not be demanded, only built. Daniel Cross and Nina Fowler and George Aldred navigated that process, which was not my strength and which I was glad to leave to people for whom it was. My role shifted. I was no longer the person watching sensor arrays in a basement. I was apparently the person who had started this, and that meant I was in rooms where important decisions were being made, often as the individual who had the clearest technical understanding of what was actually at stake and why. I did not love being in those rooms. I found the pace of institutional decision-making genuinely uncomfortable, compared to the pace of science, which was already uncomfortably slow. But I understood that the rooms were necessary, and that someone with a clear technical picture needed to be in them. Lena Marsh was appointed Earth's first formal scientific liaison to the Accord Species Relations Framework. This surprised some people, and surprised nobody who had actually worked with Lena. She had the combination of absolute scientific rigor and complete indifference to being underestimated that the role required. The first time she attended a formal Accord session, she corrected a translation error in an Accord-provided document that the Accord's own translation team had missed, and did so precisely and without apparent ego that the Accord's protocol officer made a note of it that, we learned later, was circulated as an example of effective communication style. Lena was delighted by this, and then immediately embarrassed to be delighted and then moved on, which was very Lena. Owen Birch was awarded a research grant that was technically from a private foundation, and in practice from a budget that had no public name. He used it to build a laboratory in Cape Town that operated, officially, as an environmental biology research center, and, in its actual function, as one of the 3 most advanced xenobiology facilities on Earth. He hired 23 people in the first year. He did not tell any of them the full history of why they were building what they were building. But they were smart enough people that most of them figured it out in time. Callum Reeves was not awarded anything, because he was not the kind of person who needed to be awarded things, and would have found the ceremony uncomfortable. He continued developing Ouroboros, working with a team that had grown to 31 people, building something that was evolving continuously and that he described to me, the last time I visited the facility, as still being in its early stages. Early stages, I said. He shrugged. We have had the architecture for 7 months. The Accord worked with their equivalent design for 600 years. We are very much in our early stages. I found that both humbling and, in a way I could not entirely rationalize, exciting. My brother Dan was still deployed. He called when he could. We had established a habit of talking about things other than work, about our childhood, about books, about the occasional small absurdity of daily life that persists even in the middle of historically significant situations. He told me once that he had been on an operation in a system whose name I could not pronounce, dealing with an organism that the Accord had classified as uncontainable, and that the operation had concluded in 4 hours. He said it the way he might describe a productive afternoon at work, and I understood that this was how he needed to talk about it to maintain the equilibrium that allowed him to keep doing it. I did not push. He was my brother. I knew the shape of his coping without needing the details. The strangest development in those post-acknowledgement months was the contact from other species. The Accord was a vast organization, and within it were hundreds of member species at various stages of development, and with various levels of influence. Most of them had never had direct contact with Earth. We were a new member, a minor presence, a species that most of the Accord's members knew only through the formal record, through the now revised assessment document, through whatever was said in chambers where we did not yet have eyes or ears. But word travels. Even in a civilization as old and formal as the Accord, word travels. The first contact from a non-Accord official species came through a diplomatic channel that we had not known existed, a side channel that species used to communicate informally, outside the formal record. The species that contacted us was called, in translation, something that meant roughly the gradual people, though Lena told me the translation was an oversimplification of a much more nuanced concept. They were a small species, old enough to have been Accord members for centuries, but with a level of political influence that had always been modest. Their message was brief. It said, "We heard what you did." I stared at that for a long time. "We heard what you did." In the Accord's formal language, the phrasing carried a specific meaning, not admiration exactly, not congratulation, but something closer to recognition. The recognition of one species that had been in a difficult position for a long time toward another species that had just demonstrated something about how to handle being in a difficult position. There were 14 such messages in the first 3 months after the acknowledgement, from 14 different species, all brief, all variations on the same theme. I kept all 14. I saved them in a folder labeled Simply Received. I showed Paul one of them on a day when he had come to the facility for a full briefing, and we had a few minutes at the end. He read it and handed the printout back and said, "We are going to have to be careful about what we do with this kind of thing." "What do you mean?" "I mean that we started this as a defensive action," he said. "We found a threat and we responded to it. But now we are in the Accord's framework and we have Ouroboros, and we have the Pale, and we are getting informal messages from 14 species who heard what we did. The character of what we are is going to be defined by what we do next, not by how we got here." I sat with that. He was right. He was completely right. And it was the kind of right that came from knowing someone well enough to hear the thing they needed to hear from them, rather than from themselves. We had survived. We had done extraordinary things under impossible pressure. We had changed the calculation. We had earned a seat at a table that had been used, for most of its history, to make decisions against us rather than with us. What we did with all of that was the real question. Not whether we had been remarkable in a moment of crisis. Everyone who survives a crisis was remarkable in it. The question was whether we could be remarkable in the ordinary time that followed, when the pressure was off and the choices were quieter and the temptations were different. "You are right," I said. "How do we make sure we do not get this wrong?" He looked at me with an expression that had something fond in it, which Paul expressed rarely and very genuinely. "The same way you got it right from the beginning," he said, carefully, in the dark, building things no one asked you to build. Paying attention when everyone else decides there is nothing to pay attention to. I thought about that. A sensor array no one had approved. A call at 3 in the morning. A drive to Edinburgh with printed documents and no certainty whatsoever. "That is a terrible institutional strategy," I said. "Yes," he said. "It is also apparently the one that works. 10 years is a long time and no time at all, depending on what you put in it. I am 44 years old now and I have been told, on more occasions than feels comfortable, that I am a significant historical figure. I find this an unusual thing to be told, partly because the history I am supposedly significant in is still happening, and therefore not actually history yet, and partly because the person telling me is often a graduate student, or a documentary filmmaker or a junior diplomat who was 12 years old when any of this took place, and who has a version of events in their head that is both more heroic and more linear than what actually happened. What actually happened was that I sat in a cold basement office for 11 years reading silence, built a sensor array no one approved, called a colleague at 3 in the morning, drove to Edinburgh with printed documents, and then worked with a group of extraordinary people who did things I could not have done myself, to solve a problem that should not have been solvable in the time available. What followed from that was not a triumph in the traditional sense. It was a negotiation. A long, complicated, ongoing negotiation with a civilization so much older and larger than ours that the power imbalance was objectively enormous, conducted from a position we had created by doing something that civilization had not expected us to be capable of. We are still in that negotiation. We will be in it for a very long time. Earth has a seat in the Accord Species Relations Framework. We have had one for 9 years now. We have representatives who attend formal sessions, who file communications through proper channels, who have learned the protocols and the procedural language and the unspoken hierarchies of a political structure that makes our most ancient human institutions look like recent experiments. Lena Marsh sat in the senior scientific liaison position for 7 years before stepping down to return to full-time research, which she described as one of the best decisions she had ever made. Her replacement, a woman named Grace Obie, is 7 years younger than I am and has twice Lena's political instinct, which is saying something. Owen Birch's laboratory in Cape Town grew from 23 people to over 300 in a decade. It is now the most published xenobiology research institution on the planet, and about a fifth of its published work is actually publishable. meaning it can be disclosed to the public without triggering a crisis. The other 4/5 is classified. Owen is still running it, still working impossibly long hours, still making sounds I cannot quite interpret when he finds something he did not expect to find. He found a great many things in 10 years. Some of them were wonderful. Some of them required urgent conversations with people at levels of authority I will not describe here. Callum Reeves is still working on Ouroboros. He is still calling it early stages. The team is now over 100 people, drawn from biological engineering, computational modeling, materials science, and 3 other fields that did not have names 10 years ago and now do, because Callum and his team invented the problems that required the fields to be named. He is 39 now and has the same constant movement, the same tapping and shifting and bouncing knee. He is one of the most important scientists alive and almost nobody knows his name, which he considers ideal. The Pale are deployed in 8 systems and operating on formal accord authorization in 4 of them. My brother Dan leads the 2nd deployment cohort now. He was given the option to step back from field operations 3 years ago and declined it, not because he was not given a genuine choice, but because the field work was, in his words, where the actual usefulness happened. I argued with him about this, gently, for about 20 minutes in a hospital waiting room during a routine review. He listened patiently and then said, "You built the sensor array even though it was not approved and no one asked for it, because you believed it was necessary. I am doing the same thing in a different medium. Stop worrying." I stopped worrying as much as I was able, which was not very much, but it was the best I could do. The memorial in London was opened 2 years ago. It stands in the part of the city where one of the original health clusters had been concentrated, in a small park that most people use for lunch, and does not announce its significance in any obvious way. There is a plaque that lists the people who died in the 17 cities during the period before the counter compound was deployed, the people who experienced the full progression of the colony organism's effects without any intervention that could reverse it. The number is 8 on 47. Those are the people for whom we were not fast enough, for whom my 3 in the morning detection was not 3 in the morning 6 months earlier, for whom the 12 days of early placements before my array triggered represented the difference between recovery and something that could not be recovered from. I go to the memorial sometimes, not on official occasions, on ordinary Tuesdays, when I am in the area, when I have a few minutes. I read the names. There are 8 and 47 of them. Then I look up at the sky, because I always do. Because the habit of looking up at the sky was formed over 11 years, in a basement office, and has never left me. And the sky looks the same as it has always looked, blue or gray or dark, depending on the time. Stars when it is clear enough to see them, clouds when it is not. What is different is what I know is up there. There is an Accord monitoring station in a new orbital position, one that I helped negotiate as part of the framework agreement. It no longer looks at Earth in the same way it once did. It is now part of a shared monitoring network, and the data it collects is shared, not kept. We see what it sees, and it sees what we share. That was not easy to achieve, and it is not perfect. And it requires maintenance that sometimes feels like building a wall against a tide, but it exists. There are 14 species who sent me informal messages in the months after the acknowledgement. I have met representatives of 9 of them now, in the course of formal Accord sessions and the informal gatherings that happen around formal sessions, which are where most of the actual relationships are built. Some of those relationships are still careful and cautious. One of them, with a species whose name translates to something that linguists keep arguing about, but that I have always privately rendered as the Watchers, has grown into something that I would describe as a genuine working friendship, which is the closest thing to friendship that the formal constraints of Accord relations allow. The Watchers have been in the Accord for over 1,000 years. They are not a powerful species by Accord standards. They have no military capability to speak of, modest resources, a relatively small population. What they have is an extraordinary institutional memory and an understanding of Accord politics that comes from having observed it for a very long time without being at the center of it. The Watcher representative who I work most closely with, in the translation of her name she has told me she prefers, is called Bright Surface Over Still Water. I call her Bright because the full name requires a specific vocal register that my throat is not built for, and she finds it acceptable and occasionally funny. Bright told me once, during a long session break, where we were sitting in a corridor outside the main chamber with cups of something that was not quite tea, that the reaction to Earth within the Accord was more complex than we knew. "There are species who find what you did frightening," she said, in the careful, flat cadence of a chord formal language passing through a translation system. There are species who find it impressive. There are species who find it both simultaneously. What about the Accord leadership? I asked. The Accord leadership finds it difficult to categorize, she said, which is a condition they are not accustomed to. They have very complete categories. Everything fits somewhere. You do not fit in any of their existing places, and they have not yet decided whether to build a new category or adjust the edges of an existing one. How long will that take? She made a gesture I had learned to interpret as amusement in her species. They have been adjusting an existing category for a minor coastal civilization on a world 4 sectors from here for approximately 300 years, and the process is still ongoing. You may be waiting some time. I thought about that. Bright, I said. Do you think we made the right decision? Going public with Ouroboros the way we did, showing the Accord what we had built instead of keeping it quiet. She was still for a moment. You are asking me whether you should have bluffed. In a sense, yes. The problem with bluffs, she said, is that they require the other party to believe you are capable of something you are not. The Accord had already failed to eliminate you once, because they underestimated you. A bluff would have required them to again overestimate you in a specific way. That is a very precarious position to sustain. She paused. What you did instead was show them exactly what you were capable of, which was more than they expected but also real. That is a different kind of leverage. It does not expire. I thought about that for the rest of the session and for several days afterward. It does not expire. The question I get asked most often by people writing papers or making documentaries or just sitting across from me in offices with serious expressions is whether I think humanity is safe now. Whether the Cascade Risk designation being rescinded means the threat is over. Whether the seat at the table means the galaxy has accepted us. I tell them the honest answer, which is that safety is not a destination, and acceptance is not a completed transaction. We are in a different position than we were 10 years ago. We are in a better position. We are in a position that we earned through speed and intelligence, and the specific human quality of not knowing what should be impossible, and therefore not stopping when we reach the point where impossible is supposed to begin. But we are also in a position that requires constant maintenance. The Accord is old and vast and patient in ways that we, as a species that has been spacefaring for less than a century, cannot fully model. There are forces within it that still find us difficult. There are assessments being written about us in chambers where we do not have representation yet. There are categories being adjusted. We have to keep paying attention. We have to keep building things no one asked us to build. We have to keep being the thing that does not behave the way the models say it will behave. That is not a burden. It is just the accurate description of what we are. I turned 44 last month. Paul came to the small gathering we had, in the same way Paul always came to gatherings, exactly on time with wine, and a book he had chosen with more thought than he would ever admit to. Lena was there, and Owen, who came all the way from Cape Town, and complained about the London cold with such genuine energy that it cheered everyone. Up Ada Steele sent a message from Tokyo that was characteristically precise and unexpectedly warm. Rory Holt sent a message that was characteristically blunt and unexpectedly kind. My brother called from wherever he was, which he could not tell me, on a connection that had a half-second delay and some compression artifacts that made him sound slightly more distant than he was. We talked for 20 minutes about things that had nothing to do with any of this. Our mother's garden, a book he had read, a piece of music I had been listening to, the small ordinary business of two people who know each other well and have limited time. Before he hung up, he said, "You know the Accord has a file on you now." I laughed. "I know." Lena saw part of it. "She told me what it says," he said. "It describes you as an anomalous detection event." "An anomalous detection event," I said. "Apparently they could not decide how to classify you either. So they categorized you as a phenomenon of the type that appears without prediction and requires a revision of existing models." I sat with that for a moment. Outside the window, London was doing what London always does in November, going gray and damp and completely indifferent to the significance of any given moment. Buses were running. People were walking. A child on the street below was arguing with some intensity about something that mattered enormously at her scale. An anomalous detection event. I had spent 11 years in a basement office watching for things that were not supposed to be there. I had built an array that was not approved and called a colleague at 3 in the morning and driven to Edinburgh and sat in a room in the Brecon, Beacons Hills, and told a group of serious people in serious jobs that the galaxy had decided to end us and we were not going to allow that. And then humanity, Being humanity had done the thing it always does when it decides something is not acceptable. It had paid attention. It had named the problem. It had taken the thing that was meant to defeat it and turned it into the foundation of something new. I was not sure whether that made us remarkable or simply irrepressible. I was not sure the distinction mattered. I told my brother good night. I hung up the phone and rejoined the gathering, which was warm and loud in the way that gatherings of people who have been through something genuinely difficult together tend to be warm and loud, with a quality of ease that is not carelessness but its opposite. The ease of people who know exactly what the weight of things is, and have chosen tonight to set it down briefly and just be in a room together. Outside, the sky was dark and clear for once. No clouds, you could see stars. I did not look up at them the way I used to with the searching, cataloging intensity of someone watching for something wrong. I looked up at them the way you look at a landscape you know well, that you have moved through and been changed by, and come to understand in ways that you could not have understood from a distance. We were out there in it now, not tourists, not subjects under observation, something that the galaxy had not made room for in its categories and was slowly, carefully, building a new space to accommodate. That seemed right to me. That seemed like exactly where we should be. I went back inside. There was still wine, and the conversation was good, and somewhere in orbit above us a monitoring station was sharing its data with ours for the first time in the history of our species, and my brother was deployed in a system 4 sectors away doing work that mattered, and Callum Reeves was in a facility somewhere calling everything early stages, and the world did not know most of this, and was getting along fine without knowing it. That was all right. Some things are built in basements by people reading silence. Some things are not ready to be known until they are ready. And until then, the people who know them carry them carefully. The way you carry something fragile through a crowd, not because you are afraid of what is around you, but because you know the value of what is in your hands. I went back inside, and the gathering was warm, and I was glad to be in it. I want to say one more thing, because I have been asked to, by people who will read this account in contexts I cannot fully predict, and because I have spent enough time now being careful with words, that I understand when a thing needs to be said plainly, and when it benefits from precision. The hardest part of this, looking back, was not the 3 in the morning alert, and it was not the 6-week window, and it was not the Accords open channel, or the Assessor Prime's question, or the 17 numbered sections of the response document. The hardest part was the ordinary time, the time between the alert and the first real conversation with Daniel Cross, when I had the full weight of what I knew and no resources to address it, and no certainty that anything I did would be enough. That stretch of days, maybe a week, where I was watching the health clusters grow and driving to Edinburgh and calling Paul from a motorway lobby and making decisions about who to trust and who to approach and what to say, all on the basis of an analysis that I was reasonably confident in but not completely certain of. That is where the actual difficulty lived. Not in the grand moments but in the unremarkable hours of doing the next thing when the next thing was not obviously the right thing, and the cost of being wrong was enormous. I do not have a clean lesson to offer from that experience. I do not have a principle that resolves it. What I have is the observation that the thing that made the difference, ultimately, was not a particular piece of genius or a spectacular resource or a formally sanctioned program. It was the combination of many people, working carefully in their own domains, sharing what they found, trusting the process even when the process was improvised and imperfect and built, from unapproved satellite arrays and late-night drives, Lena's rigor, Owen's precision, Ada's modeling, Rory's dogged skepticism, that eventually converted to commitment. Callum's refusal to accept that the ceiling was where others said it was. Paul's steadiness, Daniel Cross's years of preparation for a moment no one had officially told him to prepare for. My brother's choice, made freely, to be the kind of response that the situation required, all of it ordinary, in the sense that none of those people were extraordinary, in the way that stories sometimes demand, in the sense of being visionary or prophetic or uniquely suited to their role by destiny. They were all just people who were very good at their work, and who, when the actual situation arrived, moved toward it rather than away from it. That is the closest thing to a lesson I can offer. The galaxy did not know what we would do when we were pressed against a deadline we had not been told about, working on a problem we had not been warned was coming, with resources we had not been given. It made a prediction based on models built from our history, our conflicts, our capacity for disruption and noise, and the specific turbulence of a species still figuring out what it was. The models were not entirely wrong. We are turbulent. We are imprecise. We argue and we make mistakes and we build things that turn out not to work and we try again. The models missed the part where turbulence, in the right conditions, produces the exact kind of irregular behavior that a very regular system does. Not know how to predict. We are an anomalous detection event. I have decided to find that accurate rather than insulting. The stars are still there every clear night. The monitoring station still shares its data. The Accord is still very large and very old and still developing new categories for things it does not yet fully understand. We are still here. That is enough. For tonight, in a warm room with good company and wine and the sound of a city going about its ordinary business outside, that is entirely enough.